Welcome to More Than Conquerors, Chapter 2, The Meaning of Life. In this video, we're going to do a summary of Chapter 2 and cover the key points. And then we'll go through the details of the key points, and that will help you to be able to have a little more background for the chapter as you read it. So the key points of Chapter 2 is the meaning of life, which is love. And there's really four key components of that. One is that love is the goal of life, or the target we're aiming for in life. Point number 2 is, why is love the target? Point number 3 is, what inhibits the power of love in our lives? And point 4 is, what increases the power of love in our lives and our relationships. So let's just dive right in. Our key verse here is Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. And to gain some understanding of the background of this verse, we have to realize the culture that Jesus came into when he was starting to minister, to do his ministry here on earth. He came into a culture that was ruled by a very, very rigid religious system. It was a system of earning religious points, a system of compliance, and a very oppressive system that if you violated it, you were rejected by your own society, or stoned, or kicked out of society itself. And this is a system that Jesus came into and that he fought against. And he had some very harsh things to say about the religious leaders of this system, because they were oppressing the people and actually misrepresenting even the character of God, you could say, and how God wanted to relate to people in the world. And in this setting, the religious leaders were always trying to entrap Jesus within this system of law, and he always responded by stepping outside of that system and going back to relationship and identity. So that's the framework that we're set in to start the chapter. And this is the framework for this key verse and the situation that it addresses. So that, again, this is Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. And it says, "And when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they themselves gathered together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with a question. 'Teacher, which commandment is the greatest in the law?' Jesus declared, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.'" Now, Jesus' response here is very, very powerful, because God, when he gave the 10 commandments, he meant for them to be relational. He didn't mean for them to be contractual, that I'll only love you if type thinking. The 10 commandments were a covenant that God made with his people. And that's why the first and most important commandment is relational, intimately relational. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And also, the second commandment Jesus refers to is love your neighbor. So you have relationship with your neighbor, and he wants it to be loving and intimate. And then with yourself as well. He wants us to have a loving relationship with the self and our own identity. And this fulfills all things, he says. This is the goal of life. This is the target. Now, this was probably a little bit shocking to the religious leaders that he would respond in this way. Because remember, they came to entrap him, thinking that if he only says one is the most important, then he's going to try to invalidate all of them, and will have entrapped him in that sort of thinking and slandered him and punished him for it. But he answers their question in such a beautiful way because he knew the intent of God with the Ten Commandments. So as we talk about this, with love being the goal, love is the target that we're trying to hit. Jesus understands that this is all about relationship with God, and that's how this is achieved. So let's come up with a practical definition of love. Let's make it a little more personal and maybe a little bit easier to understand. So I think the best definition of love is that love is the expressing and the giving of value. So I'm going to say that again, because if you take nothing away from this chapter, please take this understanding of what love is away from the chapter. Love is the expressing and the giving of value. And the reason this definition is so important is it gives us decision points in our relating with one another and our behavior. And it has to do with being able to evaluate it. Is what I am doing and how I am relating, is that expressing and giving value, or is that taking value? Is that stealing value by manipulating for it or deceiving for it, rather than asking for value? So that's the two ways we get value. We can either manipulate and take value, or we can ask for value and trust in people's free wills to give us value. And the same way, as a decision point, we can look at how people are relating to us. Are they trying to take value by manipulation, deception, intimidation? Or are they giving value freely in love, as God has commanded us to do through Him and for Him and in our relationships? Now, this definition comes out of John 3:16, where it says, God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. So when we look at those specific words, God so loved, or God so valued the world, that He gave His most valuable thing. He gave Himself in the form of His Son, Jesus Christ. That's what He gave to the world, to express His love and how much He valued every individual in the world that He created. So, point number 2, why is love the target? Well, this concept of expressing and giving value and receiving value from God is transformative. It transforms our lives. Most importantly, it transforms the inner man. It transforms our identity. And out of identity is what flows emotion and behavior. If our identity is unhealthy, we will have unhealthy emotion and express unhealthy behavior with the taking of value through manipulation, deception, and intimidation. When our identity is healthy, then we express love freely because we're receiving love and value from God instead of trying to earn it. And we also we have an understanding of value where we don't allow value to be stolen from us underhandedly by other people. Now, it's transformative because God is love. The essence of God is love. He is the source of all love, real love, not fake love as the world wants to define it. And we're going to get into that, how the world, the system of the world, views what love is versus God's definition of love. But God is love. Now, that means he's the value giver. And our sense of value is a gift from God. It's something he's declared over every individual, that every individual has infinite value because they're made in his image of love and value. This is why it transforms our identity so incredibly powerful. Now, with this understanding and this change of identity, where the sense of value and love is a gift from God, rather than something we strive for and compete for under the world system, this drives out fear. Love drives out fear, and we're going to look at that in just a minute in the book of 1 John. But it's the presence of God being renewed in us that drives out fear, because fear and love, they cannot coexist. The greater our level of fear embedded in our identity and our thinking, the less love will be and value we'll be able to express and give in our relationships. And the higher level of love, which again is gifted from God, then the lower our fear levels will be. We'll have less of a need to have anxiety and control to get value in our relationships. It just will flow naturally out of our change of identity. So what is it that inhibits the power of love in us? Well, it's a spirit of fear. And 1 John 4:18 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. So let's break this down a little bit. In 1 John 4:18, this is describing an individual who's living under an oppressive state of habitual fear. Because of shame and guilt, they are in constant anticipation of suffering and punishment in their inner being, in their life. It's sort of a cause and effect thinking that says, I'm guilty and full of shame, and I deserve punishment, and therefore I'm going to always anticipate it and live in fear and anxiety of that. And the way I'm going to try to cope with that is creating a system of trying to earn love, earn value through a system of do's and don'ts, a rigid system, which creates a religious system of how to cope with my fear of punishment. So I'm constantly trying to make sacrifices. I'm constantly sabotaging my life and my relationships because that's what I think I deserve. That's what fear drives us to. Or I'm constantly trying to take control of everything, to have these guarantees that my need for love will be met, and to have these guarantees that I won't be facing punishment. And ultimately, for some people, we just go into complete denial, and we fall into a sense of nihilism, and we get so self-absorbed with these things that we fall into deeper and deeper self-isolation and detachment, because the fear causes us to be very reactive and to withhold and withdraw in order to feel safe. So Romans 8:15 talks about this spirit of fear, and it says that God did not give us a spirit of fear that again enslaves us. It's talking about an enslavement here to the spirit of fear. that God instead gave us, again, gifted us. It wasn't something we earned. He gave us a spirit of adoption. So we have a change of identity here by receiving the spirit of adoption, this truth that God has adopted us into his family. And that allows us to call God our Father and come boldly to him and draw near to him. Now remember why love is transformative. It's because God is love. And when we discover this freedom because of this gift God has given us to be his children, we draw near to him. And in his presence, we are transformed because he is love and he is the value giver. So it's in relationship with God that we receive unending love and value, inherent value that can't be taken away because it hasn't been earned, it's been declared over us. And now when we become enslaved to the spirit of habitual fear, it again creates this slave mentality because of the guilt and shame, and then we're always on the edge because we're in anticipation of punishment. Now, in our self-isolation, it doesn't mean we become a hermit. Sometimes we just hide in plain view by creating this false identity, this mask that we wear in plain view, but we never really have true intimacy or self-revelation. We are simply hiding behind a mask of competency and that we're all good, that I'm valuable because of all the things I've done and that I accumulate and how I present myself. But really it's a way of hiding and not revealing our true self. Now there's a crushing weight of this type of thinking where we're always earning value and striving for value, and it causes us to compare and compete and condemn with everyone around us in our lives and everyone that we relate to, because we have to do that to feel valuable and to feel better about ourselves. So we're comparing and we're competing and condemning instead of expressing and giving value. So we can have a really distorted view of what love is. Mostly in the world system, love is a performance-based system, and it's more of a possessing of people rather than relating to people. And I'm going to tell you a true story to try to illustrate this point. So I had a young woman that I worked with, and she had a child with her boyfriend, and it turned out he was very possessive and abusive. And so the people that worked closely with her at work, they helped her to get out of that relationship and get her own apartment for her and her son and end this relationship. But her ex-boyfriend now, he felt like he loved her so much he could not live without her. And so he came to her apartment and murdered her, took their son, and on the way out of the apartment, he murdered a police officer, and then he drove to a remote location and committed suicide in front of his son and left his son alone in the car with him to experience the trauma of what his father had done. And in the note he left, what he expressed is, I loved her so much I could not live without her. Now, I want you to see how his fear of not having value and not being loved drove him to commit the ultimate act of stealing value and possessing this young woman. And that was to murder her and take her life, and then ultimately take his own life in the process and have a very detrimental impact on his son for the rest of his life. Now, this is an extreme example, But I think it really demonstrates the point when we get confused about what love is and we start seeking it outside of ourselves. This bondage and this spirit of fear that it creates can drive us to some really extreme behaviors to get the love we want, rather than having an understanding of how to receive love. And so we want to move from this concept of working for love and striving for love and value, and we want to transition into being a receiver of value, because doing this is not a work. And so what we're doing is we're shifting our efforts and our thinking and the focus of our energy from working to gain it and have control over it, to having enough faith in the character of God, which is love, to be a receiver of love and value, and removing the things in our life that stop us from receiving value from God, and thus stop us from expressing and giving value in our relationships. So what is it that increases love in us and our ability to have a capacity to love well in our relationships? Well, it's just true comprehension of grace, which is, again, a component of the identity of God. And that allows us to move from earning to receiving. And it allows us to move from this way of religious coping to transformation of the very self, to have the very identity of God, which is love. Remember, love is the expression and giving of value. So God is love, he's the value giver, and it allows our identity to move from feeling valueless to feeling infinitely valuable because of what God has given to us and expressed to us. And as we abide in him and we are one with God, our true nature is restored to us, which is the very identity that God has for us, which is the image of his very self, which is love in us. And when I talk about moving from a system of religious coping, that doesn't just happen in religious systems. We see this happen all the time with people that claim to have no belief in God at all, where these very rigid systems of living and behaving are constructed, this list of do's and don'ts, and placing different values on those. And then if you step out of that system, you are punished and rejected. And we saw this with Marxism, where a very self-righteous philosophy about what individuals thought would be best for mankind. They imposed that on mankind and imposed a human nature on mankind under communism. And if you violated their very rigid rules, you were sent off to prison or put to death. And again, this all happens with this way to try to compete for and earn and gain value in these rigid systems. And it never works, because value is imparted to us by God. True value is a gift. It's not something we strive for and earn. It's simply declared over us. So every time we try to create these man-made systems, they turn into very rigid, rule-based systems where people are oppressed and abused by them if we violate these rules. So we transition again from these systems of rules where we try to gain control over everything in our lives, to receiving in relationship with God the Father, because we understand that his nature is love. And this is why Fear drives us to control, and love and control, they cannot exist in the same space because one is created by fear and the other is created by grace. Grace. And this beautiful freedom to be at rest in grace that God has given to us because of his nature. So let's look at a summary of what I just talked about. 1 John 4:7 through 18. I'm just going to summarize this as love comes from God. It's not something we can earn. So verse 7, it says, "Beloved, let us love one another because love comes from God." Notice it's not something we strive for and we create. It comes from God because it's his very essence and nature. Everyone who loves has been born of God. We're talking about identity change, being adopted into his family, born of God, and knows God, relates to God intimately. Whoever does not love does not know God, because it's in the knowing of God that we love. Without knowing God, we can't really love. We just manipulate out of our bondage to this habitual fear. So it says, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. It's his very nature. Verse 9 says, "This is how God's love was revealed among us. God sent his one and only Son into the world so that we might live through him." And verse 10, "And love consists in this, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as the atoning sacrifice for our sins." Now remember, the concept of sin is non-love. It's the taking of value. It's a condition. It's like a disease. It's not a list of do's and don'ts, because it flows from this enslavement to fear, which drives us to try to take value. It comes out of our identity. And the only way to heal that is to have a new identity, which is to be born of God, to have our original identity in his image restored to us. Verse 11 says, "Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God remains in us, and his love is perfected in us." Verse 13, "By this we know that we remain in him, and he in us." Now remember, remaining, this is living in, this is relating to. And his love is perfected in us because we're remaining in him. We're in relationship with him. By this we know we remain in him and he in us. He has given us of his Spirit, not the spirit of fear, but of his Spirit. And we have seen and testify that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world, not the condemner, not the punisher of the world, but the Savior of the world. Verse 15, "If anyone confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, he lives in him, and he in God. And we have come to know and believe the love that God has for us." Again, God is love. Whoever abides in love abides in God, and God in him. In this way, love has been perfected among us, so that we may have confidence on the day of judgment. For in this world, we are just like him. His image has been restored to us. In this way, love has been perfected to us, verse 17 says. What is the way? Abiding in God, and God abiding in us. It's the oneness with God. I love the way how Paul stresses this in Ephesians 3:14 through 19. Now, he's talking about, in the verses above that, about how we may enter into God's presence, his presence, with boldness and confidence. That's verse 12. And so in verse 14 he says, for this reason, and this reason is so we can enter into God's presence with confidence and boldness. So for this reason, I bow to my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. Again, this is identity here. That he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, in your identity, your self-concept, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, the length, and the height, and the depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. So in the love of God, this surpasses intellectual knowledge. It reaches beyond our thinking into our very identity. And in that understanding, we are filled up to all the fullness of God himself. The image of God is restored in us. And in that image, we have imparted to us value, infinite value that can never be taken away. This frees us from our fear, our guilt, and our shame, and our condemnation. And it frees us to give love and value infinitely. The children of God are the most equipped to not be offended, to not be reactive to unloving people, and instead, because we know that every person has infinite value to God, because we've received it, to interact in this world in a completely different way. So that is the summary of chapter 2, and I hope this summary really helps you get more out of reading chapter 2 and studying the book. Thank you very much.